Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Marga Walters. I am the Audiology Advisor at ACSLPA, and my colleague Susan Raffett, Deputy Registrar, will be presenting with me. A few housekeeping points. Your mics are muted and the webinar is being recorded. Just a reminder that we ask attendees to avoid using AI meeting assistants during the webinar. And please note the disclaimer on the slide that while we aim to provide accurate information, that errors can occur, and registrants are responsible for reviewing and familiarizing themselves with the relevant information contained in legislation and ACSLPA's other official documents. So today we'll be addressing the following questions. What is a restricted activity? Who can perform restricted activities? What competencies must one have to perform restricted activities? And then how are restricted activity authorizations assigned to a profession? There will be no question and answer period at the end of the webinar. And if you have any questions, please contact us using the Contact Us form on the website. So what is a restricted activity? Restricted activities are procedures or services that the legislation has determined requires a high level of professional competence to be performed safely. Restricted activities may only be performed by persons authorized by their regulatory college to do so. Restricted activities are not linked to specific health professions. That is, several professions may be authorized to perform the same restricted activity. However, they may be used in different interventions and for different purposes, depending on the profession's practice statement. An example would be ordering of X-rays. This is a restricted activity which may be performed by doctors, dentists, nurse practitioners, and dental hygienists, each within their practice statement. So, you're not able to go to your dentist with a knee problem and have them refer you for a knee X-ray. A doctor or a nurse practitioner would be able to order knee X-rays, and a dentist would be able to order X-rays related to one's teeth or oral structures. Let's have a look at which activities are restricted. The full list of restricted activities can be found in the Health Professions Act. There is a link to the Health Professions Act on our website under the college and then governing legislation and bylaws. So let me show you. So if we click on the link and then we go to the Health Professions Act on our website, and then we'll be going down to page 21. There we go, which is part 0.1, which speaks to restricted activities. And then on the next page, 22, gives us the list of restricted activities from A all the way to Q. I encourage you to go and read all the restricted activities so that you can see what actually would fall under a restricted activity. But for speech language pathologists and audiologists, our restricted activities fall under B, B1, 2, and 3, as well as 7, and then the full C, as well as the full K. So I'm now going to hand over to Susan to have a closer look at a speech language pathologist's practice statement and their restricted activities.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to move us along here. Sorry about that. So the practice statement for speech language pathologists is outlined, of course, in the Health Professions Act. In their practice, speech language pathologists do one or more of the following. They assess, diagnose, rehabilitate, and prevent communication and oral motor and pharyngeal dysfunctions and disorders. They teach, manage, and conduct research in the science and practice of speech-language pathology, and they provide restricted activities authorized by the regulations. From here, we'll proceed to the list of restricted activities that SLPs are authorized to perform. There are 5 of them, and they are 1, to insert air under pressure into the ear canal, 2, to insert or remove instruments or devices beyond the point in the nasal passages where they normally narrow. 3, to insert or remove instruments, devices, or fingers beyond the pharynx. 4, to insert or remove instruments or devices into an artificial opening into the body. And 5, to administer oral diagnostic imaging contrast agents. And we have included a link on this slide to the jurisprudence course where these restricted activities are addressed. And you'll see that link at the bottom of the slide.
So in the practice statement for audiologists, in their practice, an audiologist can do one or more of the following: assess auditory and vestibular function, and diagnose, rehabilitate, prevent, and provide appropriate devices and treatment for auditory and vestibular dysfunction. Audiologists can teach, manage, and conduct research in the science and practice of audiology, and they can provide restricted activities authorized by the regulations. The 3 restricted activities that audiologists are authorized to perform are to insert and remove instruments or devices beyond the cartilaginous portion of the ear canal, to insert into the ear canal liquid, air, or gas under pressure, and to insert into the ear canal a substance that subsequently solidifies. Again, that same link to the jurisprudence course where it speaks to restricted activities is on the slide. Just a quick reminder to please update your MyACSLPA profile on the restricted activities in which you perform. This is used for statistical purposes and can assist the college in finding registrants who perform restricted activities. From time to time, we have also surveyed individuals who are involved in restricted activities when a particular issue or concern has come up. Registrants can edit this information either through the renewal form or by clicking My Profile and then Edit Profile.
Okay, as we mentioned earlier in the webinar, each profession that is authorized to perform a restricted activity, oh my goodness, I have something coming up. There we go. I'll start again. Each profession that is authorized to perform a restricted activity will do so in relation to the type of work they're expected to perform, which is outlined in their practice statement. And although all registered SLPs and audiologists in Alberta are authorized to perform the specific restricted activities outlined in sections 67 and 68 of the restricted activity regulation, respectively, as with everything an SLP or audiologist does, they must ensure they are competent prior to embarking on an activity. So to assist with knowing what is required, several years ago, ACSLPA developed restricted activity competency profiles, and these profiles follow a basic structure as outlined on this slide, starting at number 1 at the top of the circle. The first competency is to assess the client's candidacy for the procedure. Second is to prepare the client for the procedure. Third is to conduct the procedure. Fourth is to use the equipment effectively. Fifth is to state the findings. Sixth is to apply risk management, appropriate precautions, and infection control measures as required. And seventh is to establish plans for the management of client care within the service context. And there are links to the competency profiles for both professions provided on this slide. I would say, too, that it is noteworthy that the professions of speech pathology and audiology do have different patterns in relation to restricted activity use. In SLP, the use of restricted activities is more clearly or is more caseload specific typically, and typically centered in hospital and medical settings. Most SLPs will not perform very many restricted activities throughout their career, or not at all in their practice, while a smaller subset of SLPs who use them will be using them very regularly in their practice, again, specific to their practice setting. Audiologists, on the other hand, typically use restricted activities daily with almost all, if not all, of their clients. So there is a difference, and obviously that isn't the case for every single person involved in restricted activities, but by and large, that is a pattern that I would say we have observed. So now that we have looked at the restricted activities that fall under each profession and how the general competencies are broken down when performing a restricted activity, we'll look at one SLP example in more detail, and then Margot will follow up with an audiology example. So within the competency profiles document, each restricted activity is broken down and detailed indicators are provided. To start, in relation to restricted activity 5 for SLPs, on this slide, we see that the restricted activity is to administer oral diagnostic imaging contrast agents. We then see the restricted activity description, examples of procedures where the restricted activity might be performed by an SLP, what the role of the SLP will include, and then the prerequisite knowledge that will be required to perform the restricted activity. So this is kind of all of that sort of general background information that one needs to be aware of in relation to the restricted activity. We then move to a description of each of the key competencies, which I outlined for you on that slide with the circular diagram. And there are indicators that are attached to each of those competencies. So, for example, key competency 1 is that the regulated member will assess the client's candidacy for the procedure. Indicators that are linked to that competency include recognizing the indications and contraindications for the procedure, demonstrating proficiency in client selection and candidacy for administration of oral imaging contrast agents, and conferring with other healthcare providers as required. And you'll see the second competency, preparing the client for the procedure, and the associated indicators that go along with that competency. And here we have this slide referring to the third competency for restricted activity 5, which is stated as conducting the procedure. And you can see several indicators on the right. I think something that's noteworthy is that although the restricted activity itself, the administration of a diagnostic imaging contrast agent, is a really narrow activity, there's a lot of supporting competency, if you will, that is necessary when you engage in an episode of care that involves that restricted activity. And I think the same is true for each restricted activity that SLPs and audiologists are authorized to perform. So it's not just about that piece, that little restricted activity. It's about all those other things you do as part of the intervention or the episode of care when you're involved in a restricted activity. This slide just speaks to the fourth and fifth competencies related to restricted activity 5. And then the next slide speaks to the sixth and seventh competencies. So again, really encourage you to take a look at the profiles when you have a few moments, and you can sort of see all the detail that is linked to these competencies. And hopefully it will guide you as you are thinking about what you need to know when you are preparing to be involved in restricted activities. And I'll turn it over to Margot.
For the audiology example, you can see here it's the first restricted activity to insert and remove instruments or devices beyond the cartilaginous portion of the ear canal. So the first thing in the competency profile document is a description of the restricted activity as it relates to audiology, examples of procedures that would involve that restricted activity. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. This restricted activity falls under many of the things that an audiology conducts. There's the role of the audiology in this restricted activity, and then any prerequisite knowledge that is required to perform it. Then within the document, it will provide you, as Susan said, the key competencies and then what the performance indicators are for that competency. So just to have a quick look at this. So the first one to assess the client's candidacy for the procedure is the competency, where the performance indicator would be being able to recognize any indications or contraindications, demonstrating the knowledge about the condition, the candidacy in order to for the of the client for the procedure, um, and then whether to make a medical referral. The key competency too, where you're preparing the client for the procedure. Some of the performance indicators would be that you're explaining the procedure for the client for them to provide informed consent, and then setting the client up correctly in the position for comfort and optimal visualization and effectiveness of that procedure. If we are to look at the third competency where we're conducting the procedure, the performances relate to that. So applying the techniques related to the auditory and vestibular assessment, following the protocols, the established protocols for that procedure, making any adjustments as required, and then monitoring the client's tolerance, and just in order to discontinue the procedure as indicated. Competency 4 it speaks to the using the equipment effectively, where the performance indicator would be to ensure that all your equipment are assembled according to the manufacturer's standards, that they're calibrated, that you demonstrate skill in the use of that equipment or the devices. And then the fifth competency would be the interpretation, where the performance indicator would be being able to interpret the findings of the procedure and then determining the need for referral or follow-up for that. The sixth competency is about applying risk management and infection control, and the indicators are there as well. And then the seventh one is related to establishing plans for management of the client within the service context. So now that we've had a look at the restricted activities for speech language pathologists and audiologists that they can perform and the competencies that are required for them, let's have a look at the standards of practice that now address restricted activities. Standard 6.1 addresses the performance aspect of the restricted activity, and the indicators there are shown. You can see how the restricted activity competency profiles are drawn from the standard and the indicators within. So the standard reads that a regulated member of ACSLPA performs only those restricted activities that they are authorized and competent to perform in compliance with legislation. So in order to demonstrate the standard, the regulated member will A, familiarize themselves with the activities they perform that are restricted activities. B, they will limit themselves when performing restricted activities to those activities that they are competent to perform. C, you will assess the risk and benefits associated with the restricted activity. D, you will monitor their application of restricted activity and be accountable for their action and decision making. And E, ensure that appropriate strategies are in place to address any critical or unexpected occurrences associated with the application of restricted activities. I'll now hand over to Susan, who will look at the standard of practice 6.2.
Okay, so standard 6.2 addresses the supervision of others who are involved in restricted activities. And the individuals whom an SLP or audiologist can supervise are listed in the standard on the left-hand side there in the left column. A regulated member of ACSLPA takes professional responsibility for the work of those who perform restricted activities under their supervision, direction, or control. And namely, they are speech pathology, audiology, and hearing aid practitioner students, SLPs and audiologists who require a period of supervised practice to meet a condition on their practice permit, conditional practice permit holders registered by the College of Hearing Aid Practitioners of Alberta, CHAPA, and practice permit holders registered by CHAPA who are completing a training course involving restricted activities that is being led by a registered audiologist. And then also support personnel is another group that we can supervise performing restricted activities. So to demonstrate this standard, the regulated member will meet the requirements of standard 6.1. That is, they will be able to perform the restricted activity as they are supposed to. They will have a minimum of 1 year of experience in performing the restricted activity. So it's important to remember that. They need to meet all the requirements outlined in ACSLPA's Standard of Practice 4.4 on clinical supervision. And we'll speak to that in a little more detail on the next slide. They need to determine the degree of direct and or indirect supervision that, in their opinion, is commensurate with the supervisee's competence. And they need to be available either in person or virtually or by phone for consultation while the supervisee performs the restricted activity. So these are all considerations that a supervisor needs to be aware of if they're going to be supervising someone performing a restricted activity. And just really want to make sure we draw your attention to that. In terms of Standard of Practice 4.4 on clinical supervision, again, just to highlight that indicator D is important to be aware of in relation to whether or not a restricted activity can be assigned to a support person. So whenever there's interpretation of assessment findings, we would not expect, and it would not be appropriate for a support person to be making those interpretations or completing those assessments. They might be involved in assisting with a restricted activity that relates to an assessment. So for example, they might assist with feeding as part of the administration of diagnostic imaging contrast agents, but they would never interpret results of the video fluoroscopic swallowing study. This slide just goes a little further down the road of whether a restricted activity can be assigned to a support person or not. And each restricted activity competency profile includes a footnote, one of these two that would assist in determining whether there might be interpretation or assessment involved in a restricted activity. So you can look for those on the restricted activity competency profiles.
All right. So how are restricted activity authorizations assigned to a profession? As you know, the Health Profession Act guides everything we do. In relation to restricted activities, it states what the restricted activities are, and then the regulation then indicates which professions are authorized to perform each one. Amendments to the Health Professions Act and the regulation require approval by the legislature. Regulations are extensions of the Health Profession Act itself, and they require approval by the Lieutenant Governor and Council. So any changes to authorizations to perform restricted activities must be approved in this manner. Regulators of health professions may propose amendments in relation to restricted activity authorization for the Ministry of Primary and Preventative Health Services to consider. This typically involves the development of a proposal that outlines what types of amendments a regulatory body is requesting and why, what the implications are in relation to the public, such as the risk mitigation that needs to be considered. An example of this is any educational training that would be required by the professional seeking the authorization to ensure that the restricted activities provided will be carried out in a safe and effective manner. So while amendments to restricted activity authorizations assigned to a profession can occur, it can be a potentially lengthy and complex process. We would like to thank you for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions, please contact us through our Contact Us form on our website. The link is on the slide. If you are unsure whether a particular activity is restricted, we encourage you to reach out before performing the activity, and we will be happy to help guide you. Lastly, there's also please complete the post-webinar survey by scanning the QR code on the slide. This code and the link to the survey will also be emailed out to you following this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.